In this tutorial, we're going to walk through a process for creating a section perspective of a streetscape similar to this that was created by Elizabeth Wingbo for a project in New Orleans. To start, what we're going to do is, and what you do typically with any section perspective for a project, is you would base it off of the design. In this case, I've got a snippet of a site plan and the section that was created from this. We've projected the lines up for this streetscape, created some depths for different components, and you'll see a couple placeholders in here that I typically do for sections when I'm rendering them in Photoshop, just to give myself an idea of the elevation for trees and people. For this section perspective though, we're going to take it into SketchUp, and so I'm going to do one more step where we actually give some depth to this and remove those placeholders. Now I'm going to be using SketchUp for this process, and to actually import this into SketchUp, we're going to want to eliminate a lot of other stuff from the drawing, and so what I've done is I've created a new file and I've put that line work into this new file, and only that line work. It's all on layer 0, and I've put it close to the origin so that we can simplify this file. We just call it section perspective trim. At this point, what we're going to do is going to open up a new SketchUp file. I'm going to delete our person in here. And this is SketchUp Pro. It allows us to go to File, Import. And we can import that DWG file here. That's going to tell us what we import. I'm going to close that file and zoom out. There's a couple things I want to do first to this. I want to rotate it up so that I can have it in the vertical axis, so that I can then create faces for all of this geometry and push-pull that geometry back. To start, what we're going to do is just create a shape, and I'm going to push-pull that shape up. This is how I like to rotate stuff. It just gives me the ability to orbit around in SketchUp, select the line work, and I'm going to use my rotate tool, but actually use this surface right here to click and rotate that up. We'll select this and delete it once we've created our line work. And when it comes in from AutoCAD, what we're going to have to do is either edit the component, or in this case I'm just going to explode the line work. There's several different ways to actually start to create faces on here. We can go the traditional route, just tracing some of the lines. What it'll do is start to create the faces. We also have the option of using extensions in the extension warehouse, like Make Face Pro, that will actually make all the faces as well. So whatever route you want to go with, that will actually help you to quickly create the faces in here. And once you've done that, what you actually want to do is just simply push-pull this stuff back to get some sort of depth to your section perspective. In this case, I'm going to push this direction, and we can just double-click to repeat that push-pull. Now in some cases like this, we're actually going to have to bring our line tool back and recreate some of this so we can get a face right here. So you continue to actually push-pull all of this line work back until we get a more completed view of our section perspective. Now this depth is arbitrary here, but you might strategically choose a depth based on what view you want to have. Maybe it's more of an aerial view. Maybe it needs to be a little longer if you're in this view right here. But more than just push it back, you might start to modify the actual perspective portion of this. It's almost redundant in its consistency, and we might need to show a few things like some different adjustments to the paving. Maybe as we're breaking up parking spaces on this side, we could even go in, create some curb cuts on this side. Now obviously as you go through this, you're going to have to recreate some of the lines. And now, beyond just creating some of the line work and adjusting things in perspective, maybe you're creating just control joints in your sidewalks and different things like that, you're also going to want to add in materials. And so in here what we've done is added in a few materials, both on the top surface but also through the depth right here, and begin to set up our scene. We're showing some drainage in our stormwater planner that's adjacent to this road. And you can do as much or as little as you want based on how much you want to composite in Photoshop versus do in SketchUp. A couple things that I like to keep in mind are things that SketchUp does well, like hardscape, and things that Photoshop can do really well, and those are things like vegetation and people. A few tips as you're actually setting up your view is to make sure it fills the screen. And a lot of times there's a temptation to export to where you see your entire model, but maybe that's not necessary, and you can actually zoom in and just see the focus of that. Another thing you might want to play with is just how you're orbiting up and down to get the best view of that project. I think this is kind of an underrated part of the SketchUp process, is really identifying what are the best views of your model to export. More than just the view, you might actually consider what are the different types of exports that you want to use, particularly by going to different styles. I've got the default style here, and that's perfectly fine, but another useful export once you've set your scene is to do a photo modeling export. What this allows is for you to actually select different areas just with your wand tool in Photoshop. Regardless, the most important one is going to be this default export, and we'll just go to File, Export 2D Graphic. Be sure to save your scene if you need to come back and add or remove some components so that you can have that same view of your model. Now, I've already got one exported, and I've already got a lot of layers that I want to go through and sort of show that process of building the section perspective. We'll do a few things where we actually dive into some layer mask and using brushes for that. Now, the first thing, and I just went with a straight default export, and so you can see it has this tan background, things feel really dark. So I've got 3 adjustment layers where I'm adjusting the curves, the levels, and even the hue and saturation. I've also got that modeling export from SketchUp where I can just select certain materials if I need to. Now, there's some things that SketchUp does well, but there are others that you might feel like we need to just completely replace in Photoshop to get the best result. One of those might be this soil hatch that's at the bottom of our section perspective. I've got an entire soil texture. What I've done is I've masked out just the area that sort of overlaps that. And the process for doing that, I'll sort of right here and delete our layer mask. So we have our entire layer right here. I'm going to grab my wand tool and select both of these areas. We'll turn back on the dirt and use our mask at the bottom of the layer stack here to just mask out. What it's doing, and I'll hold Option on my Mac, and you can see that the layer mask, anything that's in white shows up, anything that's in black goes away, and so we use that layer mask to just hide and reveal different parts of this layer right here. If you shift click on it, it turns off the entire layer mask. And so I'm going to do that for a few instances here. I've got a concrete texture that we've distorted to sort of fit this view. We distort using Control T, right click inside of it and say distort, and this allows us to kind of get this in the right perspective. And of course a layer mask that puts that right on the sidewalk in this case. Now, I didn't do any control joints in SketchUp. It probably would have been a good idea, but I just used a simple brush to brush these in at hopefully what looks like the right perspective. Now, one thing that I don't even try to model in SketchUp, especially if I'm on a time crunch and I need to get something produced quickly, is grass. Grass always has this tiled look in SketchUp, and sure, you can take it into Lumion, but if you don't have time for that or you don't have access to that software, replacing it inside of Photoshop is going to be an easy way to do this. So one helpful way to do it is bringing in the right picture, and of course, as we talked about earlier, creating a mask that sort of puts it in this area. I want to show this process because more than just using that brush, we're going to add a little bit of texture to it, or more than using our wand, I should say, we're going to add a little texture to this. And so I'm going to actually delete this layer mask and we're going to recreate it. From here, what I'm going to do is use my wand tool. In this case, it does kind of work to just use the wand on that grass, and I am going to add a layer mask right here. Now, what you're going to notice is that it lays it flat, just like the image that it is, right on this area right here. We can see that it is just a flat image by how we can still see that black line that defines it. So what I'm going to do is we're going to get in here, I'm going to grab a brush, hit B for brush, and we're going to go to our brushes right here. And what we're going to do is actually we're going to go to brush settings, which is also under brush right above it. And what we're going to do is create a custom brush. I'm just going to uncheck everything, go back to the brush tip shape. We're going to select this sort of blade of grass right here. I'll go to shape dynamics, bump up the size jitter, a little bit on the angle jitter just to give it a wispiness to it. I'm going to dial back the scatter and bump up the count. You can also go back to tip shape and beef up the spacing right here. And we just want to make it look like grass. Now, I want to make sure that I'm painting with white, and so I'm going to flip that to my foreground color. I'm going to change the size of it down a little bit, and by clicking on the layer mask, I can actually start to paint back that grass image right there. And so we're just painting white, which reveals the picture that's behind it. And we can just maybe click once, hold shift, and click down here, and it's going to create that brush. And so we can actually brush in a little bit to add some texture to this. Now where this becomes really helpful for me is the bioswale plants. I've got some plants here, and as I mentioned, it's a lot easier to do this in Photoshop, but in this case the plants aren't even in the right perspective, frankly. I've kind of cut some out here. And what we're going to do is I'm going to click on this layer mask, and we're going to delete that layer mask. And instead of using this sort of grass brush, we're going to go the same process, window and brush settings. And I'm going to grab, you could grab anything. You could grab a splatter brush. You could grab this one that's got sort of that leaf shape right there. I'm going to uncheck the dual brush, go back to scattering, bump up the scatter a touch, space it out a little bit. Just want to get a rougher texture around the edge. Now in this case, what I'm going to do, instead of starting with a base and then adding to it, I'm going to add a layer mask right here, and I'm going to fill that entire layer mask with black. And I'm going to use Command Delete would be the way to do that. You could, to undo that, I can just say Edit, Fill is, and then fill that with either the background color, which is black, or black right here. And what it'll do is it'll just blank everything out. My image is still there, but because the entire layer mask is black, what I'm going to have to do is actually paint with this white brush, and I can bring back those shrubs. And so what you in essence do is you start kind of painting in the plant material back into your scene, and so it can give it a little bit of roughness to it. Make sure you're not dragging in a straight line, and by clicking a lot, I'm sure you can hear that. That's sort of the best way to get some gaps in there. So we'll kind of paint all of this back in. Don't be afraid to have some that are just sort of floating out there. What I'm going to do right here is do it solid through here, but I'm going to come back with my lasso tool and lasso out the curb. So I'll finish this up. Again, I might be a little more refined than this. I want some that are kind of hanging over the curb. I don't think that's a terrible idea, so I might come back and add that in. But if I need to, I'll just turn down the opacity of this whole layer. I'll grab my lasso, and I'm going to click. What this will do is highlight that area, and I'm going to do Edit and Fill. In this case, I'm going to fill with black to sort of blank that out. I'll dial the opacity back up. Like I mentioned, I could come back in some spots and maybe just sort of have some that are hanging on the edge of the curb right there. Alright, so obviously some other things to do. I can do occasionally some adjustment layers. My grass might be too bright for my taste, so I'm going to turn down the hue and saturation. Do a little grass overlay where we just sort of paint on there and darken up some spots. I've got a road tile here, so I just found this, and in the same way that I distorted the image, sort of broken into two halves and distorted by using Control-T and of course right-click and distort to put these road tiles into place. Added in a few people, adjust the curves, hue and saturation for those people. Same thing for the bioswale plants, just to brighten them up. And there's a few extra things you can do. Obviously adding in trees, bring those in, have even one in the foreground. You might want to vary them up. These look a little too stamped, frankly. But along with that, a trick that we've talked about in other videos is to duplicate this tree. We'll rename it Tree to Shadow. And just grabbing Control-T, we're going to say flip vertical, which flips it over, and bring it down here, and we will we'll say distort. And so in this, I'm going to take this tree, begin to lay it flat on the ground. It takes a little bit of practice to get this right. I don't know where the direction is of sun. I probably need to look a little bit. You can see from these people it's kind of hitting on this side, mostly looking at the tree in here as well. I just want to lay the shadow flat. Now it's not exactly a shadow yet, it's just an image of the tree, but to fix that, we will just go to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, and I'm just going to bump the lightness up on this. I can also go through and say Filter, Blur, and we'll do a motion blur, where we just sort of maybe a little bit of a motion to it, change the distance up on it. Maybe motion blur is not the best one. We could try a few different ones. We'll say like a lens blur, just kind of a general blur to it. I'll say OK to that. And of course dial back the opacity, maybe change it to multiply, and anyway, get a feel for how those trees might begin to cast some shadows. What's nice about it, I can then just grab that shadow, bring it over here for this tree. I've kind of blurred it into oblivion, so probably could have just used a brush to do that. And of course, with your section perspective, you want to make sure that not to have a shadow out in space here. So just take that and delete it out. Anyway, those are some tips just to kind of get you going with a section perspective. If you're going to start with your AutoCAD line work, bring it in, create a few faces, push them back, start to make some adjustments to the top surface and the perspective part of it, whether it's curb cuts or adding in control joints, things like that. And then to bring it into Photoshop, bring it to life, collaging in people, plant material in particular, and starting to take the rough edges off of SketchUp in particular with how the materials just fit really flat on that. So again, this is a great inspiration for us. You can see a lot of the same techniques, a different modeling program that sort of dials back that hard edge that you see in SketchUp. Maybe a great approach would be just to turn the edges off when you export it out of SketchUp, bringing in multiple trees, having a boardwalk in here, turning back the opacity on these trees, another great touch. And of course bringing in an Illustrator and putting some different labels and diagramming on top of it. A really great example, a really quick process that you can use multiple modelers to actually execute this. So hope this was helpful, and thanks for checking it out.